we need to talk about Bitcoin. So hey everyone, welcome back to Upside Down Data. Today I want to talk about Bitcoin, which on the day currently has rallied nicely and is looking like it's trying to close at new year-to-date highs, at least in terms of closes. And this is interesting because actually today there was another delay by the SEC in making a decision about a spot Bitcoin ETF. But yet, even despite that, Bitcoin is rallying on that news, which is quite notable in some ways. So the question I want to address is, do we think that Bitcoin is going to continue its rally? Is it maybe going to finally target the 40K range, which we've talked about before and many other people have been talking about? Or might it be losing steam and maybe it might take us a bit longer to do that than some people think? So let's go ahead and get into it. So I want to look at some of our models to kind of address this question. So the first model I want to look at here is our short-term upside downside potential indicator, or UDPI. So this is a risk model that we have here at the channel. This is the short-term version, cares about moves that play out over days to weeks. Basically higher levels, higher risk, lower levels, lower risk. And what you'll notice, notably about the short-term UDPI, is it's actually behaving quite similar to the prior legs up that we've seen in coming out of the year, basically in this year that we had, this first initial big move up. You saw the short-term UDPI really top out, and then indeed we had really kind of exhausted our short-term upside potential, kind of chopped around, had a correction, then went back up, same kind of thing, had a correction, went up, same thing, correction, went up again, and it's looking quite similar. We're actually falling off of very similar levels to these two peaks back over here, and you're actually seeing the short-term UDPI roll over now. So I think there are two possible interpretations. You could say, well, it's just going to be exactly the same as the last two times. We're going to bleed out, we're going to have to correct, and then maybe that's what will set the stage for the next leg up. Certainly possible. But the other thing that you can look at here is, as the short-term UDPI cools off, that suggests that there's an increased amount of relative upside versus downside potential that Bitcoin is accruing that it might be able to use in the short term. Basically, as this falls, really what the short-term UDPI is telling us is what is the plausible upside relative to plausible downside potential. We're now right around zero, where it's about equal for Bitcoin. And so it suggests that Bitcoin does have room to continue moving to the upside if it wants to, but it also has room to move down to the downside. And in these prior moves up, we kind of got to about that break-even point, a little bit above, and then we had to go cool off before we could move up again. So I think the question that we're going to have to ask is, are we still in that type of environment where Bitcoin can only really muster kind of one more leg up before it needs to cool off and have a decent correction? Or maybe we're actually going to have something more like, for example, 2019 or early bull markets, where it can actually sustain these moves a little bit higher without necessarily having to correct down to the same levels. So we'll have to wait and see, but I think either of those is potentially in the cards. Now, another thing that we can look at that might point more towards the direction of needing to have a correction, or at least consolidation from here, rather than just being able to reverse from these levels and move up, is if we look at our trend confidence indicator, or TCI. I had posted about this on X a little while ago, and it looks like some of it might be playing out. We're going to have to watch and see what happens. But basically with the TCI, what it's telling you is how confident should you be in a given trend. And so if you see price moving up and the TCI moving up, that's a good sign. And in fact, oftentimes the TCI will lead price. The TCI will start moving up first, and then price will follow. That happened coming into the beginning of the year. But then you'll see that there are times the TCI will be falling down, will be in a downtrend, while price might even be in an uptrend. That's a concerning sign, which might mean that the strength of this move is really weakening, and that a correction, or at least consolidation, might be soon to come. And that's what we saw here. Then we had this push up, same thing again. TCI corrected, and then price went down to correct as well. TCI moved up, price moved up, and then had to go down correct. And then leading up this entire way, TCI was moving up, bullish sign, got the big move up. But notably now we're seeing that divergence start to play out again. We're seeing price moving up here still, while the TCI is moving to the downside. And so the question that I had posted about was, will this be the same as this previous time? We're seeing weakness on the TCI. Is this kind of the last hurrah in price that we're in the middle of right now? Like what we've seen in each of these legs up, you'll have this kind of final hurrah in prices to put in the actual local top of that move before you then consolidate and correct. Could we be in the middle of that? And I think right now it's certainly possible, and that's why I think it's going to be really important to watch how Bitcoin behaves in the next few days, over the next week, we're going to find out which of those is the case. If we close up here, but then we immediately show weakness, have to go back down and test lower levels, that would start to look an awful lot like this, where Bitcoin's not able to sustain those higher prices and you might have to come back down, which might mean we have a longer correction in store for us. But if Bitcoin can get above this level, and then maybe if it just can continue into the green tomorrow, especially the next couple of days, that would be a sign of strength. That might mean that we can eventually make our way up into the 40Ks. We'll have to wait and see, but certainly the possibility, the hypothesis of us not being able to quite get there yet is certainly there, and that's why I think the next few days are going to be really important to watch. But of course, those are short-term considerations. In the longer term, in some ways, it does it really matter all that much if Bitcoin can hit 40K now, or if it has to go through another correction before it can move up again. It certainly does seem like Bitcoin is in a much better footing, is in a bullish footing now, certainly outperforming what a lot of people thought was possible and behaving a lot like an early bull market. And one of the things that we can look at that goes along with that thinking that this is early bull market behavior for Bitcoin is our momentum bias indicator, or MBI. That's what I'm showing you here. So this is a momentum indicator. So basically it's looking at how, and it's a momentum bias specifically. So it's looking at, is the momentum biased to the upside? Is the prevailing momentum to the upside and it moves down, quickly bought up and we move back to the upside? Or is the momentum biased to the downside? And what you'll see when you look at Bitcoin and really any chart, when you pull up the MBI for any asset, you'll see these phases that in bear markets, you're spending a lot more time in the red than in the green. You'll kind of be in the red. You'll poke your head up above zero, get rejected, move back down. Same behavior in every bear market. We can see that for Bitcoin. We did it again just all the way through here in 2022. But then you go into this phase of transition out of bear markets into bull markets. And that tends to be characterized by this oscillation around zero, which is exactly what we're doing right now. And the reason that this makes sense for early bull markets is that the MBI is a z-score in what it's outputting. And so a z-score 0 equals the mean, in this case, the mean momentum, average momentum. And so for Bitcoin, that's obviously positive. Bitcoin's been moving to the upside. It has a positive average momentum. And then up and above that are denoted in standard deviation units. And so basically, how many standard deviations are you above or below the mean on momentum bias or momentum tendency? So if you're just sticking around the average, that's a bullish thing. Sticking around the average is a good thing for Bitcoin because its average momentum is positive. If you're just hanging around zero, that's a good sign. It really takes these extreme deviations below zero to pull us down into these bear markets. So we're in that period of oscillation right now. We can see that in the beginning of the year, we poked up a couple times, we poked up again on the third move up, went back down to the red, and now we're back up again. This is exactly the kind of thing you'd want to see in an early bull market. And I talked about this many times during this phase, that you'd like to see this continue. And then ultimately what it can lead into is this build up into a moment where you're now suddenly spending more and more time up in the green, hardly ever dipping down into the red until you finally hit that blow off top at the top of, or around the top of the market cycle. So I personally don't think that we're going right into this phase right now. Some people do. Some people saying we're going right off to all-time highs imminently, like this here is the move. Some people are saying that where we are right now, for example, is the same thing as where we were right back here, for example. Anything's possible. I personally don't subscribe to that. I think that it's I personally think it's more likely that we're still building up a base and we're still kind of have to spend more time kind of oscillating here around zero before we get ready for that big blow off move. But of course, anything's possible. But regardless of whether or not we're at this stage, it does still seem a lot more like a bull market than a bear market. So that's something you'd like to see. Now, the final thing I wanted to talk about with the MBA also, though, here, and this also can tell us a little bit about the short term, is you'll notice that we've gotten up to this level about 0.4. You'll notice that in previous early bull markets, this is about as high as you see the MBI get before you put in some kind of a local top. We saw it here, and we maybe are seeing it again here, where you set in these local tops, you then have to go back down and then correct, but then you can move back up, so on and so forth. And that can even happen in an overall uptrend like we see here in 2015, 2016, 2017. You can see that this oscillation can still happen in a price uptrend, but it might just mean that a local top might be approaching. So anything's possible. In 2019, we did break above that, and then we had to cool off for a while before we actually put in the big parabolic move. So it's not unprecedented for us to be able to break higher while still in an early bull market. but it does seem very possible to me that we're getting closer to a local top for Bitcoin. But the more important thing, I think, is regardless of that, and obviously short-term calls are always very speculative. Price can do whatever it wants. A lot of things can move things in the short term. But long term, this is exactly the type of thing we like to see happening with Bitcoin. All right, so to wrap us up then, I want to talk about some broader considerations with Bitcoin and where we stand right now. So specifically looking at broader markets and how they might bear some relevance to what's going on right now. So one of the things that we're seeing on the DXY, which is an important market to watch, in my opinion, when it comes to crypto. So the DXY is the strength of the dollar relative to a basket of other fiat currencies. And it tends to be inversely correlated with crypto. When the DXY is going up, Bitcoin tends to go down. When the DXY goes down, Bitcoin tends to go up. This is a well-known inverse correlation in the space. And notably, more recently, we had rallied hard out of these July lows, but now the DXY has been showing notable weakness and actually really got crushed yesterday following the favorable CPI inflation print. Now we're kind of consolidating here, but really if we continue to see weakness here, if we can break below this resistance on 104, retest the lows and even break down lower, that would, in my opinion, add more bullish fuel to the fire and might make it more likely for Bitcoin to be able to continue on its merry bullish way and maybe break up into some of these higher price levels. And we can see that the relation of the DXY to Bitcoin really matters if we look at something like the Bitcoin DXY fair values. This is a model that I had built. I've talked about this before on the channel, which is really looking at what is the fair value of Bitcoin while considering what the DXY is doing. And you can see that this can be a very useful thing to watch, where it can, for example, lead into bull markets like here in 2020, 2021, and also lead into bear markets like it did down here, or leading up in here, and then also paving the way to the downside, leading the way up, so on and so forth. And interestingly, if we zoom in more recently on what's happening, you can see that Bitcoin, for the first time all year, broke above its DXY base fair value. It was undervalued relative to what the dollar was doing the entire year. And I had talked about this many times in the past, posted on this about this on X multiple times, how we remained undervalued. Now, we have seen Bitcoin now break above that fair value level, although it is now starting to follow you up. And that is expected. In bull markets, you will have times where Bitcoin will get above its DXY base fair value, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It really only becomes a concern if it gets too far away from it. You'll note at these notable tops, it really starts to outstrip, get really far away from the DXY fair value. As long as we're relatively close, it's probably not that huge of a concern. And that's just another reason why I think watching what the DXY does here will be important. That if the DXY continues to correct and move down, that'll probably be favorable and show up favorably on the DXY base fair value. And the more of these things can move together, or we could actually, if we actually see Bitcoin get undervalued again versus the dollar, then that would just be, again, more bullish fuel to the fire. You'd expect price to follow the fair value up. So something that I'm certainly going to be watching closely. And the final thing I wanted to talk about is, also looks like the stock market has been moving back up in a favorable way. That it really, ever since July, it had been trending down. That was likely adding a headwind for crypto, but then crypto recovered and now the stock market is moving up as well. And we're getting participation across risk assets, which might just correspond to a broader appetite for risk, which generally speaking is good for Bitcoin and good for crypto. So we'd like to see that also continue. If the NASDAQ, which is what I'm showing you here, can break out above the year-to-date highs, and especially if the NASDAQ can break out to new all-time highs from there, I think that would be a great turn of events, and it would be adding a tailwind for crypto. It would really help crypto out. Now, is it going to go there immediately? Who knows? Maybe, maybe not. I think it would make sense for it to have to set in higher lows, et cetera, before it could get there. But something that I'm going to be watching very closely, that if these broader favorable conditions for risk assets continue to play out, it just adds more and more bullish fuel to the fire for crypto, which has already been very bullish this year, to potentially continue that on. And so even if we have some short-term correction, as we were talking about, based on the short-term UDPI, based on the TCI, that is just going to look like small potatoes potentially in the future if those bullish dynamics play out and Bitcoin can eventually break it to new all-time highs. Again, I don't think that's going to happen immediately. I think we probably have more time to spend shopping around at lower levels. But it does seem like we're in a new early bull market. And so if we can do things like avoid a recession, then it seems very plausible that we just do the same thing that we've done in the past one more time and go into that bullish cycle. So these are things that I'm going to be watching to see how that plays out. So if you want to view data from our models and more live, you can do so at our website, PolarityDigital.io. And if you like the content, remember to subscribe to the channel, give the video a like, and follow us on X. A lot of updates about our models and more over there.